In the ancient Greek city of Soli, around 280 BCE, a child was born who would one day write more books than you could read in several lifetimes. 700 works. 700. Most of them lost now, scattered to time like leaves in an autumn wind. But the ideas they contained, those ideas did something extraordinary. They saved an entire philosophy from disappearing. They built the logical foundation that would support human beings through plagues, wars, the collapse of empires, and the long, dark centuries that followed. This child would grow into a man so brilliant, so utterly obsessive, that his contemporaries both marveled at his genius and laughed at his peculiarities. His name was Chrysippus, and he constructed the intellectual architecture that transformed Stoicism from a promising but vulnerable school of thought into an unshakable fortress of wisdom. You have probably never heard his name. Even people who know about Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, even people who practice Stoicism today, often skip right over Chrysippus. But here is something you should know. Without this strange, brilliant, impossibly prolific philosopher, there would be no Marcus Aurelius, no meditations, no Stoic wisdom to guide you through difficult times. The entire tradition would have collapsed under the weight of philosophical attacks from rival schools. Chrysippus stood between Stoicism and oblivion, and he held that line not with charisma or political influence, but with sheer intellectual force. He outthought, out-argued, and outwrote everyone who challenged him. And in doing so, he gave future generations a gift more valuable than gold, a complete system for understanding reality, making ethical decisions, and finding peace in a turbulent world. Before we can understand what Chrysippus built, we need to understand what he inherited. Stoicism did not begin with him. It began with a shipwrecked merchant named Zeno of Citium, who lost everything when his vessel sank in the Mediterranean. Washed up in Athens with nothing but his life, Zeno wandered into a bookshop and discovered philosophy. He found his true calling among the dialogues of Socrates and the teachings of the Cynics. Eventually, he established his own school, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch that gave Stoicism its name. Zeno's vision was powerful and original, combining elements from earlier philosophies into something new. He taught that virtue was the only true good, that the universe was rational and ordered, and that human beings could achieve happiness by aligning their will with nature's inevitable unfolding. When Zeno died, leadership passed to Cleanthes, his most devoted student. Cleanthes was a remarkable figure in his own right, a former boxer who worked as a water carrier at night to support his philosophical studies during the day. He wrote the magnificent hymn to Zeus, one of the most beautiful expressions of Stoic theology ever composed. But Cleanthes, for all his personal virtue and poetic gifts, was not a systematic thinker. He could inspire people with the emotional and spiritual dimensions of Stoicism, but he struggled to defend the school's doctrines against the sophisticated logical attacks coming from rival philosophers. The academy, heir to Plato's tradition, was now dominated by skeptics who questioned whether certain knowledge was even possible. The Epicureans offered an alternative philosophy of pleasure and atomistic physics. Other schools attacked Stoic ethics, Stoic logic, and Stoic physics with arguments that Cleanthes found difficult to counter. Into this crisis walked Chrysippus. Born in Soli, a city in Cilicia, he was the son of parents about whom we know almost nothing. What we do know is that he came to Athens and initially studied with the academic skeptics, the very philosophers who were attacking Stoicism. This early training in skeptical argumentation would prove invaluable. Chrysippus learned how to construct devastating logical arguments against philosophical positions. He learned how to identify assumptions, expose contradictions, and systematically dismantle theories. And then, at some point in his studies, he encountered Cleanthes and the teachings of the Stoic school. Something in Stoicism spoke to him in a way that skepticism never had. Here was a philosophy that did not merely question and doubt, but offered positive answers about how to live, how to think, and how to understand the cosmos. Chrysippus became a student of Clanthus, and it quickly became apparent that this young man possessed an extraordinary mind. While other students struggled to defend Stoic doctrines, Chrysippus could not only defend them, but develop them further, answer objections that had not even been raised yet, and construct elaborate logical systems that made Stoic ideas virtually unassailable. His contemporaries noticed this talent immediately. There was a saying in ancient Athens, "If there were no Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa." The Stoic school would have withered and died under the sustained attacks of rival philosophies, if not for this one man's intellectual defense. When Cleanthes died, probably around 230 BCE, Chrysippus became the third head of the Stoic school. He was perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, an unusual age to assume leadership of a philosophical movement. But the school needed what only Chrysippus could provide, not inspirational poetry or personal charisma, but rigorous logical foundations that could withstand any criticism. And that is exactly what he set out to build. To understand Chrysippus, you must understand something unusual about his character. He was obsessed, not in the casual way that people today claim to be obsessed with their favorite television show or food, genuinely obsessed, in a way that struck even his ancient contemporaries as excessive. He wrote constantly, compulsively, with a productivity that seems almost inhuman by modern standards. 700 works. Let that number settle in your mind. Even if many of these were short treatises rather than full-length books, the sheer volume of writing is staggering. Ancient sources tell us that he sometimes produced 500 lines a day, every day. What drove this relentless productivity? Part of it was certainly the intellectual environment he inhabited. Athens was a battleground of ideas, with rival schools of philosophy constantly challenging each other's positions. Every argument needed a response. Every objection needed an answer. Every doctrine needed defense and elaboration. But there was something else at work too, something in Chrysippus's own nature that compelled him to pursue completeness and systematic coherence with single-minded intensity. He could not leave a question half-answered or an argument partially developed. He had to work through every implication, consider every objection, explore every logical consequence. His contemporaries found this both admirable and slightly absurd. Stories about Chrysippus's eccentricities circulated in Athens. He would apparently write anything and everything, including extensive quotes from other authors, to the point where his books sometimes contained more citation than original argument. One critic joked that if you removed all the quoted material from Chrysippus's works, nothing would be left. This was unfair, but it captured something true about his method. Chrysippus believed in thoroughness. He did not just present his own ideas, but engaged extensively with what others had said, quoting them, analyzing their arguments, showing exactly where they went wrong. There was also his legendary stubbornness in argument. Chrysippus would not concede a point unless absolutely forced to by irrefutable logic. He would pursue a line of reasoning through every twist and turn, follow it down every branching path, consider every possible objection. This made him an exhausting person to debate, but it also made him nearly unbeatable in philosophical disputation. When Chrysippus said he had proven something, he had actually proven it by the standards of ancient logical argument. He left no loose ends, no unexplored alternatives, no unaddressed counterarguments. Ancient sources also tell us that Chrysippus had peculiar personal habits. He apparently refused invitations to dinner parties, preferring to work alone rather than engage in the social rituals expected of prominent philosophers. He avoided the gymnasium, that central institution of Greek life where men exercised and socialized. He poured all his energy into thinking and writing, treating philosophy not as a social activity or a path to personal fame, but as a technical discipline requiring complete dedication. This antisocial tendency might seem unappealing, but it served a purpose. Chrysippus was not trying to win admirers or build a personal following. He was trying to construct an intellectual system that could stand on its own merits, independent of his personality or social skills. There is something deeply admirable about this single-minded focus on the work itself, rather than the rewards that might come from it. Chrysippus apparently did not care about being popular or well-liked. He cared about being right and about defending truths that he believed were important for human flourishing. This attitude produced work of extraordinary rigor and depth, even if it sometimes lacked the literary elegance of other philosophers. Chrysippus was not trying to write beautiful prose. He was trying to construct airtight arguments that could withstand any intellectual assault. Chrysippus inherited from Zeno and Cleanthes a vision of philosophy as having three interconnected parts: logic, physics, and ethics. These were not separate disciplines, but aspects of a unified understanding of reality. Logic taught you how to think correctly about anything. Physics taught you what the universe actually is and how it works. Ethics taught you how to live well, given the nature of reality that physics revealed. Chrysippus compared philosophy to a garden, where logic was the protective wall, physics was the growing trees, and ethics was the fruit, or to an egg, where logic was the shell, physics was the white, and ethics was the yolk. These metaphors emphasized that you could not have one part without the others. A proper understanding of ethics depended on correct physics, and both depended on sound logic. Previous Stoics had sketched out ideas in all three areas, but their treatments were often incomplete or vulnerable to criticism. Chrysippus set himself the monumental task of systematically developing each part of philosophy to the highest possible standard of rigor and completeness. He would begin with logic, because without a sound method of reasoning, nothing else could be trusted. Then he would move to physics, using that solid logical foundation to understand the nature of reality. Finally, he would show how ethics flowed naturally from correct understanding of physics and logic together. This systematic approach was revolutionary. Earlier philosophers often leapt straight to ethical questions without first establishing clear methods of reasoning or comprehensive theories of nature. Chrysippus insisted that you had to build from the ground up, starting with the most basic questions about knowledge and reasoning, then working toward practical questions about how to live. This made his philosophy more demanding and difficult to grasp initially, but also more stable and defensible in the long run. You could not simply dismiss Stoic ethics without first refuting Stoic physics, and you could not refute Stoic physics without first showing that Stoic logic was flawed. This created multiple layers of defense that made the entire system remarkably resilient. The integration of these three parts also reflected a deeper conviction that Chrysippus held. Reality is one thing, not three separate realms. The laws that govern how we should think are the same laws that govern how nature operates, which in turn determine how we should live. There is a logos, a rational principle, running through everything. Logic studies this principle as it appears in human reasoning. Physics studies it as it appears in the structure and processes of the cosmos. Ethics studies it as it appears in human action and character. Understanding any one of these aspects helps you understand the others, because you are always studying the same underlying reality from different angles. This vision of unified knowledge contrasted sharply with other philosophical schools. The Epicureans treated physics and ethics as largely separate concerns, with physics serving mainly to eliminate fear of divine punishment rather than to guide practical life. The academic skeptics questioned whether secure knowledge was possible in any domain. Chrysippus insisted that knowledge was not only possible but interconnected. with truths in one area supporting and illuminating truths in others. This optimistic rationalism, the conviction that reality is fundamentally intelligible and that human reason can grasp its essential structure, was central to everything Chrysippus built. Chrysippus understood that before you could have knowledge of anything, you needed a clear account of what knowledge is and how reasoning works. This might seem obvious, but many philosophers rushed past these questions to get to more exciting topics like ethics or metaphysics. Chrysippus refused to do that. He devoted enormous effort to developing Stoic logic, creating what was arguably the most sophisticated logical system in the ancient world. His work in this area was so influential that it remained the standard treatment of logic for centuries, only gradually being replaced when medieval Islamic and European philosophers developed new logical theories. The foundation of Chrysippus's logic was his theory of impressions and assent. When you perceive something, your mind receives an impression, a fantasia. This impression is not yet knowledge or belief. It is simply the raw material that your senses provide. What transforms an impression into belief is an act of assent, where your rational faculty judges that the impression is reliable and corresponds to reality. This might sound like a small distinction, but it had profound implications. It meant that error and false belief were always results of misusing our rational faculty, giving assent to impressions that we should have examined more carefully or withheld judgment about entirely. Chrysippus distinguished between different types of impressions. Some impressions are cognitive or cataleptic, meaning they are so clear and distinct that they practically compel assent from a rational person. These cognitive impressions come from real objects, accurately represent those objects, and could not have come from anything else. When you have a cognitive impression, you can safely give your assent and form true belief. The trick is learning to distinguish cognitive impressions from non-cognitive ones that might seem clear but are actually misleading. This required developing good judgment through practice and philosophical training. But Chrysippus knew that individual impressions and beliefs were not enough. We also need to reason from what we know to reach new conclusions. This required a theory of inference and argument. Chrysippus developed an elaborate system of propositional logic, studying how simple propositions combine into complex ones and how conclusions follow from premises. He identified 5 basic argument forms that he called the indemonstrables, because they were so obviously valid that they needed no proof themselves. All other valid arguments could be reduced to these 5 fundamental patterns through systematic analysis. The first indemonstrable had this structure: if the first, then the second, but the first, therefore the second. This is the basic form of conditional reasoning that even children use naturally. The second indemonstrable: if the first, then the second, but not the second, therefore not the first. This is the equally obvious pattern of reasoning backwards, from the absence of a consequence to the absence of its cause. The third, not both the first and the second, but the first, therefore not the second. The fourth and fifth dealt with disjunctive reasoning, arguments involving either-or propositions. What made Chrysippus's treatment of these argument forms sophisticated was his systematic analysis of how complex arguments could be broken down into these simple patterns, and how longer chains of reasoning could be validated by showing that each step followed one of the indemonstrables. He was doing formal logic, studying the structure of arguments rather than their content. This was remarkably advanced for the ancient world and anticipated developments that would not fully re-emerge until the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Chrysippus also had to address challenges from skeptical philosophers who argued that certain knowledge was impossible. The skeptics presented various arguments suggesting that our senses can deceive us, that reason can lead to contradictions, and that we have no reliable criterion for distinguishing truth from falsehood. Chrysippus needed to answer these challenges without falling into dogmatism or overconfidence. His solution was to argue that cognitive impressions themselves provided the criterion of truth. When you have a genuine cognitive impression, it carries its own guarantee of reliability. You can be certain of it because of its intrinsic clarity and distinctness, not because you have some external proof that it is accurate. This idea that some impressions are self-evidently reliable was controversial and remains so. Critics then and now have argued that subjective certainty does not guarantee objective truth. People can feel absolutely convinced of things that are actually false. Chrysippus acknowledged this but insisted that truly cognitive impressions were different from mere subjective conviction. They had an objective character that distinguished them from false appearances. Learning to recognize this character was part of becoming philosophically trained and developing wisdom. With logic established as the foundation, Chrysippus turned to physics, the study of nature. For the Stoics, physics was not merely an academic interest, but had profound ethical implications. Understanding what the universe actually is and how it operates was essential for understanding how human beings should live within it. Chrysippus developed a comprehensive cosmology that integrated insights from earlier philosophers with distinctively Stoic ideas, creating a worldview that was both scientifically sophisticated by ancient standards and spiritually meaningful. At the heart of Stoic physics was the idea that the universe is a living, rational organism pervaded by divine intelligence. The Stoics called this animating principle pneuma, a kind of intelligent breath or spirit that permeates all matter and gives it structure and coherence. Pneuma is not separate from matter, but mixed with it at every level, from the vast movements of celestial bodies down to the internal organization of individual organisms. This pneuma is also logos, rational principle, and also God or Zeus. The Stoics were pantheists who identified God with nature itself, or more precisely, with the rational principle that structures and guides natural processes. Chrysippus had to defend this conception against various objections. How could God be material and still be God? How could one thing be both rational principle and physical stuff? His answer was that reality itself is fundamentally active and rational, not divided between inert matter and separate mind or spirit. Pneuma is the active principle that gives coherence to passive matter, but they are never actually separated. They interpenetrate completely, creating the unified cosmos that we observe. This led to one of the most distinctive and controversial aspects of Stoic physics, their theory of total blending. Chrysippus argued that different substances could interpenetrate each other completely without losing their individual identities, like wine mixed through water where every drop of the mixture contains both wine and water fully blended. Pneuma blends with matter in this way, present in everything, while still maintaining its coherent identity. This allowed the Stoics to explain how the divine rational principle could be everywhere at once, animating and structuring the entire cosmos. Chrysippus also developed a detailed account of causation. Everything that happens has a cause, and causes operate according to rational necessity. Nothing is truly random or uncaused, though some events appear random to us because we do not understand all the causes at work. This strict determinism raised obvious questions about human freedom and moral responsibility. If everything is predetermined by prior causes, stretching back to the beginning of the universe, how can anyone be held responsible for their actions? This problem would occupy Chrysippus extensively when he turned to ethics. The Stoic cosmos was not eternal in the sense of existing forever unchanged. Instead, Chrysippus taught that the universe goes through repeated cycles of existence. In each cycle, the cosmos develops from pure fire, the most active and divine element, gradually differentiating into the four elements of earth, water, air, and fire. These elements combine to form the complex structures we observe, including plants, animals, and human beings. Eventually, the cosmos gradually returns to pure fire in a conflagration where everything is consumed and purified. Then, the cycle begins again, with the cosmos developing along exactly the same pattern as before. This doctrine of eternal recurrence meant that everything that has happened will happen again, infinitely many times. Chrysippus himself would be reborn, would study philosophy, would write his 700 books again and again throughout eternity. Some ancient critics found this disturbing. Others saw it as expressing profound trust in the rationality and goodness of the cosmic order. If everything happens according to divine reason, then the pattern of events must be the best possible pattern, worth repeating eternally. For Chrysippus, physics was not abstract speculation but had direct relevance to human life. Understanding that the cosmos is rational, ordered, and divine meant that nothing happens by accident. Everything, even apparent disasters and evils, plays a necessary role in the perfect unfolding of nature. Human beings, as parts of this rational cosmos, have the capacity to understand and accept their role within it. This understanding would become the foundation of Stoic ethics. One of Chrysippus's most important contributions was his sophisticated treatment of fate and determinism. This was not merely a theoretical problem, but had direct implications for how people should understand their lives and actions. If everything is determined by prior causes, and those causes stretch back to the beginning of the universe, then in what sense are human beings free? And if we are not free, how can we be held morally responsible for our actions? These questions threaten to undermine Stoic ethics entirely. Chrysippus needed to show how determinism and responsibility could coexist. Critics of Stoicism presented various arguments against the possibility of reconciling fate with freedom. The most famous was called the lazy argument. It went like this: if you are fated to recover from illness, you will recover whether you call the doctor or not. If you are fated not to recover, you will not recover whether you call the doctor or not. Therefore, calling the doctor makes no difference. You might as well do nothing. If we extend this reasoning to all actions, it seems to suggest that nothing we do matters because the outcome is already determined. Why make any effort if fate will bring about whatever is going to happen regardless? Chrysippus's response to this argument was brilliant and subtle. He distinguished between simple and co-fated events. A simple event would be something that is fated to happen regardless of other circumstances, like the lazy argument assumes. But Chrysippus argued that most events are co-fated, meaning they are fated to happen through specific causes and conditions. Your recovery from illness is not fated to happen whether or not you call the doctor. Rather, your recovery is fated to happen through calling the doctor, as is your action of calling the doctor itself. The outcome and the means to that outcome are both part of the same causal chain, both equally necessary. Think about it this way. If it is fated that you will recover, this does not mean you will recover regardless of what you do. It means the entire sequence of events, including your decision to seek medical help, is part of what brings about your recovery. The fated outcome includes the necessary means to that outcome. Removing those means would change the outcome, but you cannot remove them because they too are fated. You are not choosing between predetermined outcome and free choice. You are participating in the causal chain that constitutes your fate. This distinction allowed Chrysippus to preserve both strict determinism and meaningful human action. Our choices and efforts matter enormously because they are essential links in the causal chains that produce outcomes. When you deliberate about what to do, when you make an effort to achieve something, you are not fighting against fate, but participating in how fate actualizes itself. Your agency is real, even though it operates within a completely determined causal system. Chrysippus developed this idea further with his distinction between principal and auxiliary causes. When a cylinder rolls down a hill, the push that starts it rolling is an auxiliary cause. The cylinder's round shape and internal structure are principal causes of its rolling motion. Similarly, external circumstances are auxiliary causes of human action, but the principal cause is our character and rational faculty. External events provide occasions for our choices, but those choices flow from who we are as persons. Even though the development of our character is itself determined by prior causes, it is still truly our character, and our actions genuinely express it. This analysis addressed another worry about determinism. If my actions are caused by my character, and my character was shaped by forces beyond my control, how am I responsible? Chrysippus would say that responsibility does not require being the ultimate uncaused source of your actions. It requires that your actions flow from your own rational nature. When you act badly, the problem is not that you are forced by external compulsion, but that your character is flawed. And even though you did not create your character from nothing, it is still yours, and you can work to improve it through philosophical training and practice. The Stoics also developed a doctrine of assent that showed how determinism could accommodate something like freedom. Although our impressions and circumstances are determined, we still must give assent to those impressions, to form beliefs and motivations for action. This assent is up to us in a meaningful sense, because it flows from our rational faculty. We cannot avoid receiving impressions, and given our character, we will inevitably assent to some impressions and withhold assent from others. But the assent itself is our action, our rational response to circumstances. Working to ensure that we assent only to correct impressions and proper motivations is the work of philosophical development. Chrysippus spent enormous effort working out the details of these ideas because so much depended on getting them right. If Stoicism could not answer the challenge of fatalism, if it reduced human beings to passive recipients of predetermined events, then its ethical teachings would be meaningless. His sophisticated treatment of fate and determinism allowed the Stoics to maintain both cosmic determinism and human responsibility, both divine providence and individual agency. This was one of his most important achievements, influencing not just ancient philosophy, but later medieval and modern discussions of free will and determinism. Having established logic as method and physics as worldview, Chrysippus could finally develop ethics, the study of how humans should live. But Stoic ethics was not simply a set of rules or virtues to be followed. It flowed directly from understanding what human beings are and what place they occupy in the rational cosmos. Ethics for Chrysippus was applied physics, showing how creatures with rational nature should align themselves with the rational structure of the universe. The foundation of Stoic ethics was the principle that virtue is the only good and vice is the only evil. Everything else, including health, wealth, reputation, pleasure, and even life itself, is neither good nor evil, but indifferent. This seems like a radical and counterintuitive claim. How can health be neither good nor bad? Chrysippus had to explain and defend this central Stoic doctrine against obvious objections, while showing that it followed logically from proper understanding of human nature. The argument begins with the observation that human beings have a distinctive function or characteristic activity. Just as the function of a knife is to cut, and we judge knives as good or bad based on how well they cut, humans have a function, and we should judge human lives as good or bad based on how well they fulfill that function. But what is the human function? It is to live according to reason, to exercise our rational capacities in understanding and choosing. This rational capacity is what distinguishes humans from other animals and makes us capable of philosophy, ethics, and conscious alignment with nature. If living rationally is the human function, then virtue is nothing other than excellent rational functioning. The virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance are all aspects of reason operating excellently in different domains of life. Wisdom is reason understanding what is truly good and bad. Courage is reason, maintaining right judgment in the face of fear and difficulty. Justice is reason, directing our relationships with others properly. Temperance is reason, governing our desires and impulses. All virtue is really one thing, reason or wisdom, expressing itself in different contexts. Vice is correspondingly the failure of reason to operate properly, leading to false judgments about what matters and confused responses to circumstances. When someone pursues wealth as if it were truly good, or avoids poverty as if it were truly evil, they are making a fundamental error of judgment. They are treating indifferent things as if they had ultimate value, which distorts their entire understanding of what matters in life. This confusion leads to all the negative emotions that disturb human peace: fear, grief, excessive desire, and agitation. But what about the things we naturally care about, like health, family, and security? Chrysippus explained that these are what the Stoics called preferred indifference. They are not good in the strict sense because they do not contribute to virtue, which is the only true good. But they are naturally preferable because they accord with our nature as biological and social beings. It is natural and appropriate to prefer health to sickness, wealth to poverty, life to death. These preferences are built into us by nature and serve important functions. The wise person will generally pursue preferred indifference and avoid dispreferred ones, but will never mistake them for true goods or evils. This distinction allowed the Stoics to acknowledge that some external things matter for practical purposes, while maintaining that virtue alone determines whether a life is good or bad. A virtuous person in prison or poverty is still living well, because their rational faculty is functioning excellently. A vicious person in health and wealth is living badly, because their rational faculty is corrupted by false judgments. This does not mean we should be indifferent to whether we live in prison or freedom, only that we should not think these circumstances determine the quality of our life at the deepest level. Chrysippus faced a particularly difficult challenge regarding the emotions or passions. The Stoics argued that emotions like fear, grief, and excessive desire were actually false judgments and should be eliminated entirely by the wise person. This seemed inhumane to critics. Are we supposed to feel nothing when loved ones die or when facing danger? Chrysippus had to show that the Stoic position was not actually advocating cold heartlessness, but rather a different relationship to life's difficulties. The key was understanding that Stoic apatheia, freedom from passions, was not the same as having no feelings or cares. It meant freedom from irrational, disturbed emotional states based on false judgments about good and evil. Fear is not simply the feeling of danger approaching. It is the judgment that something bad is about to happen to you, combined with the mistaken belief that this bad thing can truly harm you. Grief is not simple sadness, but the judgment that you have lost something good, combined with the false belief that external losses can make your life bad. These emotions are cognitive, involving judgments that can be true or false, rather than mere bodily feelings. The wise person, having correct understanding of what is good and bad, will not experience these disturbed emotions, but they will have what the later Stoics called good feelings, or eupatheiai. Instead of fear, they will have caution about what is genuinely bad, namely vice. Instead of disturbed desire for externals, they will have rational wish directed toward virtue. Instead of grief over external losses, they will have a kind of sober acceptance of how things are. These good feelings are appropriate responses by a rational mind, unlike the passions which are disturbances caused by false judgment. Chrysippus's ethical teachings included several paradoxes, claims that seemed to contradict common sense, but followed logically from Stoic principles. These paradoxes were not just provocative slogans, but represented serious philosophical positions that Chrysippus defended extensively. Understanding them reveals the radical nature of Stoic ethics and how it challenges ordinary assumptions about value and morality. The first paradox is that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. If you are virtuous, you have everything necessary for a good life, regardless of your external circumstances. You could be tortured on the rack and still be happy, in the Stoic sense, because your rational faculty remains excellent and your life is unfolding as it should for a being whose function is rational activity. This seems absurd. How can someone being tortured be happy? Chrysippus would respond that happiness is not pleasure or comfortable feeling, but rather the smooth flow of life according to nature. If you maintain virtue under torture, accepting that your suffering is part of the rational cosmos and refusing to judge it as truly evil, then your life is going well, even though your body is experiencing terrible pain. Critics attacked this paradox relentlessly. Surely there is more to a good life than just having the right internal attitudes. Surely external goods like health and freedom matter for happiness, even if they are not the only things that matter. Chrysippus stood firm. If anything external is required for happiness, then happiness is vulnerable to fortune and chance. You could have virtue, but lack happiness through bad luck. This would mean that doing everything right, developing perfect excellence of character, might still leave you miserable. That conclusion seemed unacceptable to Chrysippus. It would mean that the universe is not rational, and just after all, since even the virtuous could be unhappy through no fault of their own. The second paradox is that all sins are equal. If virtue is one thing, wisdom, then vice is also one thing, foolishness. Someone who is foolish makes errors of judgment, treating indifferent things as truly good or bad. It does not matter whether those errors are large or small. A person who makes any error in the most important matter, what is truly good and bad, is fully in error. It is like being underwater. It does not matter whether you are an inch below the surface or 100 feet down. You are drowning either way. Someone who is vicious is fully vicious, regardless of whether their particular sins are murder or petty theft. This paradox troubled many ancient readers and continues to trouble modern ones. Obviously, murder is worse than petty theft. Chrysippus would agree that murder is more dispreferred than theft, that it causes more harm to others and violates social norms more severely. But from the perspective of the agent's character, both actions flow from the same root problem: false judgment about what matters. The murderer and the thief are both treating external things as truly good or evil and acting on that false belief. Their characters are both corrupted by the same fundamental error, even if that error manifests in different degrees of social harm. The third paradox is that only the wise person is free. Everyone else is a slave, even if they are not legally enslaved. Freedom is not about external status, but about internal condition. The wise person is free because they have liberated themselves from false beliefs and disturbed emotions. They are not controlled by desires for external things or fears of losing them. Their rational faculty operates according to its own nature, guided only by truth and virtue. In contrast, those who lack wisdom are enslaved to their passions, driven by desires for pleasure, wealth, or status, and by fears of pain, poverty, or death. These internal masters control them more completely than any human owner could. This paradox had particular force in the ancient world, where slavery was widespread and often brutal. The Stoics were saying that legal freedom meant nothing compared to internal freedom of the rational mind. A slave who developed wisdom could be more free than a king who remained in bondage to his passions. This offered profound consolation to those who lived under oppression or hardship, suggesting that true freedom was available to anyone who achieved it through philosophical development. But it also risked seeming to minimize the real evils of slavery and oppression by treating them as indifferent matters that did not affect genuine freedom. The fourth paradox is that the wise person is also wealthy, beautiful, and kingly, regardless of their external circumstances. They are wealthy because they are content with what they have and desire nothing more. They are beautiful because their soul is harmonious and well-ordered. They are kingly because they rule over the only domain that truly matters, their own rational faculty. Meanwhile, those who are externally wealthy, beautiful, or powerful, but lack wisdom, are truly poor, ugly, and slavish, because they are controlled by external circumstances and internal passions. These paradoxes were not meant to be taken literally in all respects. Chrysippus knew that the wise person in poverty was not actually wealthy in the ordinary sense. But the paradoxes expressed important truths about value and about where genuine good is located. They challenged listeners to question their assumptions about what really matters in life, and to consider the possibility that the conventional understanding of success and failure might be completely backwards. Chrysippus developed a practical method for achieving virtue that centered on the concept of assent. Remember that in his theory of knowledge, impressions come to us from our senses and from our own thoughts, and we must give assent to those impressions to form beliefs and motivations for action. The key to virtue lies in disciplining our assent, learning to assent only to correct impressions while withholding assent from false or misleading ones. This sounds simple but is extraordinarily difficult in practice and requires lifelong training and effort. When you receive an impression that something bad has happened, you face a choice. You can immediately assent to that impression, forming the belief that you have been harmed and generating emotions like grief or anger. Or you can pause and examine the impression more carefully. Is the thing you lost actually bad in the strict sense, or is it merely a dispreferred indifferent? If it is only an indifferent, then you have not actually been harmed in any way that matters. You have experienced a change in circumstances that is naturally unwelcome, but your capacity for virtue and your fundamental well-being remain untouched. If you withhold assent from the initial impression of harm, and instead assent to the correct understanding of what happened, you will not experience disturbed emotions. This practice of disciplined assent requires tremendous awareness and constant vigilance. Our initial impulses and impressions are automatic. When something apparently bad happens, we naturally form the impression of being harmed before we can think about it consciously. But Chrysippus taught that there is a space between receiving an impression and giving assent to it, and in that space lies our freedom and our capacity for virtue. We cannot control what impressions arise, but we can control whether we assent to them. The challenge is that most people have spent their entire lives assenting automatically to impressions without examining them. They have developed deeply ingrained habits of judgment that treat health, wealth, reputation, and similar things as truly good, and their opposites as truly evil. These habits cannot be changed overnight through intellectual understanding alone. They require systematic retraining through practice and repeated application of correct principles to actual circumstances. This is why philosophy for the Stoics was not just about learning doctrines, but about transforming your entire way of responding to life. Chrysippus recommended several practices for developing better assent. First, study and deeply understand the philosophical principles that distinguish true goods from indifference. If you have not fully internalized the teaching that virtue is the only good, you will not be able to apply it consistently when circumstances challenge you. Second, practice examining your impressions in low-stakes situations. When something mildly annoying happens, catch yourself before you assent to the impression of harm and consciously recognize it as merely a dispreferred indifferent. This builds the habit of pausing and examining impressions rather than automatically assenting to them. Third, review your actions and reactions regularly, identifying cases where you gave assent to false impressions and generated inappropriate emotions. This self-examination helps you see patterns in your responses and gradually correct them. Fourth, prepare in advance for likely difficulties by imagining them and rehearsing correct responses. If you know you will face a challenging situation, practice examining the impressions that will arise and determining which deserve assent and which should be rejected. This premeditation of adversity was a core Stoic practice that Chrysippus held systematized. The discipline of assent also applied to impressions of good things happening. When something preferred occurs, we naturally form the impression that something good has happened and feel pleasure and delight. But if we assent to this impression, we are making the same error as when we assent to impressions of harm. Preferred indifferents are not truly good, so their presence does not actually improve our life in the most important sense. The wise person will recognize that preferred outcomes are indeed preferable, and will rationally choose them when possible, but will not experience the disturbed emotion of excessive joy that comes from treating them as true goods. This might seem like a recipe for emotional flatness, neither feeling bad about losses nor good about gains. But Chrysippus would say that what replaces disturbed emotions is something better, a calm joy that comes from living according to reason and virtue. This joy is not dependent on external circumstances, but flows from the excellent activity of your rational faculty itself. It is the satisfaction of functioning well as the kind of being you are, of participating consciously in the rational order of the cosmos. This joy is stable and unshakable because it does not depend on anything external to your own character and choices. One of the most important implications of Chrysippus's physics and ethics was his doctrine of Providence. Because the cosmos is rational and governed by divine intelligence, everything that happens serves the best possible plan. Even apparent evils and disasters are necessary parts of a perfect whole, like shadows that help define light or dissonant notes that contribute to overall musical harmony. This is not simply an optimistic claim that things generally work out well. It is the much stronger claim that every single detail of how things are is exactly how it must be in the best possible universe. Chrysippus had to defend this doctrine against powerful objections. If the cosmos is governed by perfect divine providence, why is there so much suffering, injustice, and evil in the world? Why do innocent people suffer while the wicked prosper? Why does nature produce diseases, disasters, and death? These questions had troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries. Chrysippus needed to show how belief in providence was compatible with the obvious presence of suffering and apparent evil. His answer had several parts. First, what we call evils are not actually bad in themselves, but are necessary for the existence of corresponding goods. Courage cannot exist without danger. Justice cannot exist without competing claims and scarce resources. Wisdom cannot develop without mistakes to learn from. If we removed all occasions for vice, we would also remove all opportunities for virtue. A world without challenges would be a world where human excellence was impossible. The apparent evils in the universe are actually the conditions that make human virtue and rational life possible. Second, many things that seem bad from a limited human perspective serve important functions in the larger cosmic order. Predators seem cruel when they kill prey animals, but predation maintains ecological balance and prevents overpopulation that would lead to mass starvation. Diseases and parasites, however unpleasant, play important roles in natural systems. Death itself, while naturally avoided by living creatures, is necessary for renewal and change. If nothing ever died, the universe would stagnate. What seems like destruction from one perspective is transformation and renewal from another. Third, the suffering and injustice that humans experience are not actually harmful in the most important sense, because they do not affect virtue. A good person who suffers injustice is still good, still living well in the sense that matters. Their rational faculty remains excellent. Their life is unfolding, as it should, for a rational being who responds to circumstances with wisdom and virtue. The injustice they experience is a dispreferred indifferent, something naturally unwelcome but not truly bad. If we keep in mind the distinction between indifference and true goods, we can see that evil, in the strict sense, vice and false judgment, does not happen to people, but is something they do to themselves through their own choices. This doctrine of providence had profound practical implications. It meant that the proper attitude toward everything that happens is acceptance. Not passive resignation, but active acknowledgement that what is happening is part of the rational cosmic order, and therefore, at some level, right and necessary. This acceptance does not mean you should never try to change circumstances, or that you should be indifferent to suffering. You should still prefer health to sickness, justice to injustice, peace to war. But you should recognize that whatever actually happens is happening according to providence and therefore cannot be truly bad. Chrysippus expressed this with a powerful metaphor. We are like dogs tied to a moving cart. The cart, representing fate and providence, is going where it is going regardless of what the dog does. The dog has two choices. It can resist, pulling back against the leash and being dragged painfully along. Or it can run willingly alongside the cart, going where it is going anyway but without the pain and struggle of resistance. The wise person is the dog that runs willingly, accepting and even embracing what fate brings, because they understand that resistance is both futile and irrational. This acceptance was not meant to make people passive or to discourage action. You should still act to pursue preferred indifference and avoid dispreferred ones. But you should act with a kind of detachment or reserve, what the later Stoics called a reserve clause. You do everything you can to achieve the outcome you prefer, but you accept whatever actually happens without disturbance because you know that the outcome is determined by providence and therefore must be part of the best possible plan. If your efforts succeed, good. If they fail despite your best efforts, that too is fine, because it means something better than success was needed by the cosmic order. Critics found this doctrine troubling for several reasons. If everything that happens is providentially ordained and therefore right, does this mean we should not try to change bad situations? Should we accept slavery, tyranny, and injustice as parts of the divine plan? Chrysippus would respond that we can and should work to reduce suffering and promote justice, but we should do so while recognizing that whatever actually happens is happening for necessary reasons. Our efforts to improve things are themselves part of how providence operates. If our efforts succeed, providence ordained that they succeed. If they fail, providence ordained that too. The deeper response is that Stoic acceptance is not about external circumstances, but about internal response. You accept that whatever happens is not truly evil, not harmful to what matters most. This acceptance frees you to act more effectively because you are not paralyzed by fear of failure or disturbed by setbacks. You can work for justice without the bitterness and resentment that often accompany moral passion. You can face difficulties without being broken by them because you understand that nothing external can actually harm you. Although Chrysippus emphasized individual virtue and internal freedom, he also developed a sophisticated account of social ethics and human community. The Stoics taught that human beings are naturally social creatures, and that living according to nature means fulfilling our social roles and responsibilities. But Stoic social ethics was based on a distinctive understanding of what connects human beings to each other and what obligations we have to our fellow humans. The foundation of Stoic social thought was the idea of oikeiosis, often translated as appropriation or affiliation. This concept referred to the natural development of concern and attachment that begins with self-preservation and gradually extends outward to encompass larger communities. When you are born, you are concerned primarily with your own survival and well-being. As you mature, this concern naturally extends to your parents and immediate family. Then it extends further to friends, neighbors, fellow citizens, and eventually to all human beings and even to the cosmos as a whole. This expansion of concern is natural and rational, not requiring that you abandon self-concern, but rather that you come to see others as extensions of yourself. Chrysippus argued that rational beings have a special relationship to each other that transcends ordinary animal connections. All rational creatures, human and divine, participate in the same logos, the universal reason that structures the cosmos. This participation creates a natural kinship among all rational beings. We are all, in a deep sense, family members sharing in divine reason. This means that what benefits one rational being ultimately benefits all, and what harms one harms all. The apparent conflicts between individual interests are based on false understanding of what our true interests are. This cosmopolitan vision was radical for its time. Most ancient ethical systems focused on relationships within particular communities, city-states, or ethnic groups. The Stoics insisted that every human being, regardless of their origin or status, was your fellow citizen in the cosmic city. The slave and the emperor, the Greek and the barbarian, the man and the woman, all shared equally in rational nature and therefore had equal fundamental worth. This did not mean that social distinctions and roles were meaningless or should be abolished, but it meant that these conventional distinctions did not reflect differences in intrinsic worth or create fundamentally different moral statuses. Chrysippus distinguished between the duties or appropriate actions, kath konta, that all people share, and the perfect actions, katothomata, performed only by the wise. Appropriate actions are those that accord with nature and can be reasonably defended, like caring for your parents, helping friends, fulfilling contracts, and participating in civic life. Even non-wise people can perform appropriate actions by following natural impulses and social conventions. Perfect actions require that you perform appropriate actions with the correct understanding and motivation, recognizing why these actions are fitting and choosing them because they express virtue rather than because they bring external rewards. This distinction allowed the Stoics to give practical guidance to ordinary people while maintaining high standards for complete virtue. You do not have to be a sage to live decently and fulfill your social obligations. You can be making progress toward wisdom by learning to perform appropriate actions more consistently and for better reasons. But true virtue requires more than just doing the right things. It requires doing them with complete understanding of why they are right and with a perfected rational faculty that sees clearly what truly matters. Chrysippus also addressed questions about justice and fairness in social relations. Justice is one of the four cardinal virtues, the proper functioning of reason in our interactions with others. The just person gives to each what is due to them according to their nature and relationships, but what is due to people. Chrysippus argued that we have different degrees of obligation to different people based on natural and social relationships. You have stronger obligations to family members than to strangers, not because family members are intrinsically more valuable, but because your relationship with them is closer, and you are better positioned to help them. This created a kind of concentric circles of obligation, with yourself at the center, since you cannot help others if you do not maintain your own capacity to act. Your immediate family in the next circle, extended family and close friends in the next, fellow citizens beyond that, and eventually all human beings in the outermost circle. The wise person acts appropriately toward everyone while recognizing these natural priorities. You should help strangers when you can, but if forced to choose between helping a stranger and helping your child, choosing your child is not only acceptable, but required by justice because that is the appropriate action given your relationship. However, and this is important, these priorities apply to actions, not to fundamental moral concern or respect. Every human being, regardless of their relationship to you, deserves recognition as a rational creature participating in the cosmic logos. The emperor and the slave both deserve respect for their rational nature, even though your obligations to each might differ based on social roles and relationships. This created tension that later Stoics would explore more fully, between accepting social hierarchy as part of conventional life while maintaining that all humans are fundamentally equal in worth. Chrysippus recognized that very few people, perhaps no one in actual history, achieved complete wisdom and perfect virtue. He himself did not claim to be a sage. The sage was more of an ideal standard than a description of attainable reality. But this did not make Stoicism impractical or irrelevant to ordinary life. Between the sage and the completely foolish person was a category of those making progress, the prokoptontes. Most of Chrysippus's ethical teaching was directed at these people, showing them how to move gradually toward wisdom, even if they never reached complete perfection. Progress toward wisdom requires three things: correct teaching, practice, and habituation. You must first learn the philosophical principles that distinguish true goods from indifference, virtue from vice, and correct from false impressions. This requires study with teachers or with philosophical texts, careful thinking about difficult questions, and gradual refinement of your understanding. But knowledge alone is insufficient. You must also practice applying these principles to actual circumstances, training yourself to respond virtuously even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. Habituation refers to the gradual development of settled character traits through repeated action. When you first try to withhold assent from false impressions or to prefer virtue to external goods, it feels forced and unnatural. Your ingrained habits pull you toward conventional responses. But if you persist, acting correctly even when it feels wrong, gradually your character reshapes itself. What once required conscious effort becomes automatic. What once felt unnatural becomes your natural response. This is how you move from knowing what virtue is to actually being virtuous. Chrysippus compared this process to learning a craft. At first, every movement is awkward and requires conscious thought. A beginning carpenter must carefully think about each step, measuring precisely, checking constantly. But with practice, the movements become fluid and automatic. The master carpenter knows what to do without thinking about it consciously, because the craft has been internalized through long habituation. Virtue is similar. The sage responds virtuously without internal conflict or effort, because virtue has become their character, their second nature. But the path to wisdom involves not just developing new habits, but also eliminating bad ones. Most people have been giving assent to false impressions their entire lives. They have developed deep patterns of treating externals as truly good or evil. These patterns will not disappear simply because you learn that they are wrong. You must actively work to identify and correct them whenever they arise. This requires constant self-examination, catching yourself when you respond to circumstances as if they were truly good or evil, rather than merely preferred or dispreferred. The Stoics recommended several practices for making progress. Daily self-examination involves reviewing your actions and reactions from the day, identifying cases where you failed to act virtuously, and understanding why you failed. This helps you see patterns in your weaknesses and develop strategies for improvement. Morning preparation involves anticipating challenges you will face during the day and rehearsing virtuous responses. If you know you will encounter a difficult person or situation, you can mentally practice responding with patience and wisdom rather than anger or fear. Another important practice was meditation on death and impermanence. By regularly reflecting on the fact that you and everyone you love will die, that all your possessions will be lost, that your reputation will fade, you diminish the false value that your mind places on these indifferent things. If you deeply internalize the temporary nature of all externals, it becomes easier to maintain equanimity when you actually lose them. This is not morbid pessimism, but realistic acceptance of how things are. Chrysippus also emphasized the importance of philosophical community. While virtue is ultimately an individual achievement, we need others who share our philosophical goals to support our progress. We need teachers to correct our misunderstandings, fellow students to practice with and learn from, and exemplars who inspire us through their own progress. The Stoic school provided this community, a place where people committed to the philosophical life could gather, study together, and support each other's development. The path to wisdom is long and difficult. Chrysippus was honest about this. You will fail repeatedly. You will assent to false impressions, act on disturbed emotions, and forget your philosophical principles in the heat of difficult circumstances. This is expected and normal. The key is to persist despite failures, treating each mistake as a learning opportunity rather than a cause for despair. Every time you catch yourself responding badly and correct it, you strengthen the habit of correction. Over time, failures become less frequent and less severe. One philosophical problem that Chrysippus grappled with extensively was how we can have knowledge of other minds. This might seem like an abstract technical problem, but it had important implications for ethics and social life. If we cannot know what others are thinking and feeling, how can we make ethical judgments about their actions? How can we distinguish virtue from vice in others? How can we have meaningful relationships if we are fundamentally uncertain about what is happening in other people's minds? The skeptical philosophers who were Chrysippus's main opponents raised powerful arguments against the possibility of knowing other minds. When someone acts in a way that appears virtuous, we observe only their external behavior. We do not observe their internal motivations, their reasons for acting, or their character traits. But Stoic ethics holds that what makes an action virtuous is not the external act itself, but the internal condition of the person performing it. Two people might perform the same external action, one virtuously and one not, depending on their motivations and understanding. If we cannot access internal states, we cannot distinguish virtuous from non-virtuous actions in others. Chrysippus's response drew on his theory of signs and inference. We often have to reason from observable effects to unobservable causes. When we see smoke, we infer fire even though we do not directly observe the fire itself. Similarly, we can reason from observable behavior and speech to unobservable mental states. If someone consistently acts in certain ways, speaks certain words, and exhibits certain patterns of behavior, we can reliably infer something about their character and motivations. These inferences are not certain in the absolute sense, but they are reliable enough for practical purposes. He distinguished between signs that are merely indicative and signs that are demonstrative. An indicative sign suggests it's signified but does not prove it conclusively. Demonstrative signs, in contrast, stand in such a necessary relationship to what they signify that their presence proves the existence of what they signify. Chrysippus argued that certain behavioral patterns were demonstrative signs of character traits and mental states. If someone acts consistently in certain ways over long periods and in varied circumstances, this demonstrates rather than merely suggests what kind of person they are. This analysis had important ethical implications. It meant that we could make reasonable judgments about others' characters, even if we could not have certain knowledge of their private mental state. If someone consistently acts courageously in genuinely dangerous situations, not just once but repeatedly, this demonstrates that they have the virtue of courage. We do not need direct access to their internal state to know this. Their pattern of action is sufficient evidence. However, Chrysippus also recognized the limits of our knowledge of others. We might be mistaken about someone's character because we have not observed them in enough situations or because we have misinterpreted their behavior. Someone might appear virtuous on the outside while being vicious on the inside. This means we must be humble about our judgments of others and willing to revise them as we gain more evidence. But it does not mean that such judgments are impossible, or that we should withhold all moral evaluation of others. The practical upshot was that Stoics should focus more on their own character and actions than on judging others. You have direct access to your own mind and can work to improve it. You have only indirect access to others' minds and should be cautious about condemning them. This did not mean moral relativism, or that all behaviors should be accepted as equally valid. Some actions are clearly vicious regardless of the agent's internal state. But it meant approaching moral judgment with appropriate epistemic humility, recognizing the limits of what we can know about others' motivations and character. Chrysippus made groundbreaking contributions to the study of language and meaning that would influence linguistics and philosophy for centuries. He recognized that understanding how language works was essential for clear thinking and effective communication. If we do not understand the relationship between words, meanings, and things, we will constantly fall into confusions and fallacies. His theory of meaning distinguished three things: the word itself as a physical sound or inscription, the meaning or sense conveyed by the word, and the actual thing the word refers to. The word is material and perceptible. The thing referred to might also be material, like a physical object, but the meaning is something else entirely, what Chrysippus called the lekton, or syllable. This is neither material nor purely mental, but a kind of abstract content that can be expressed in language. To understand this distinction, consider the difference between the word dog, the meaning of the word dog, and an actual physical dog. The word is just sounds or marks. The dog is a flesh and blood animal. The meaning is something else, a conceptual content that allows the word to refer to the thing. Different languages use different words for the same meaning, showing that meanings are not identical to words. And we can meaningfully talk about things that do not exist, like unicorns, showing that meanings are not identical to things either. Chrysippus developed a sophisticated analysis of different types of lecta. Simple lecta are basic meanings like predicates and names. Complete lecta are meanings that can be true or false, what we would call propositions. An imperative like close the door expresses a complete lecton, but one that is neither true nor false. A question like, "Is the door closed?" expresses a complete lecton that requests information rather than asserting truth. Propositions like, "The door is closed," are complete lecta that have truth values and can serve as premises and conclusions in arguments. This analysis allowed Chrysippus to clarify the structure of arguments and to identify precisely where fallacies occurred. A fallacy is not just any mistake in reasoning, but specifically a case where the form of an argument is invalid or where meanings shift in problematic ways. By carefully analyzing the logical form of arguments and the meanings of the terms involved, Chrysippus could show exactly why bad arguments fail and why good arguments succeed. One of his most important contributions was his treatment of conditional propositions. A conditional has the form if P, then Q. But what makes a conditional true or false? Chrysippus argued that a conditional is true if and only if the denial of the consequent is incompatible with the antecedent. In other words, if P then Q is true when you cannot have P true and Q false at the same time. This sounds technical, but it captures an important logical relationship between the parts of a conditional statement. Different philosophers propose different truth conditions for conditionals, leading to fierce debates about apparently simple statements. If someone says, if it is day, then it is light, under what conditions is this true? Chrysippus's answer allowed him to explain why certain valid argument forms work, and why certain fallacies are indeed fallacious. His treatment of conditionals influenced later development of logic in the medieval period and beyond. Chrysippus also analyzed various logical paradoxes that troubled ancient philosophers. The most famous was the liar paradox. If someone says, I am lying, are they telling the truth or lying? If they are telling the truth, then they are lying as they claim, so they must be lying. But if they are lying, then they are not lying as they claim, so they must be telling the truth. This seems to create an impossible contradiction where the statement is both true and false. Chrysippus spent enormous effort trying to solve this and related paradoxes. His proposed solutions were technical and not entirely successful, but the attempt itself was important. It showed his commitment to logical rigor and his recognition that even apparent paradoxes needed to be addressed rather than dismissed. If language and logic contain genuine contradictions, then our entire system of reasoning might be unreliable. Chrysippus wanted to show that apparent contradictions could be resolved through careful analysis of meanings and logical structure. Another famous puzzle was the sorites, or heap paradox. One grain of sand is not a heap. Adding a single grain to something that is not a heap cannot create a heap. But if you keep adding grains one at a time, eventually you have a heap. Where exactly does the heap come into existence? This paradox challenges our ordinary concepts and shows that many of our terms have vague boundaries. Chrysippus's response was subtle and has been interpreted differently by modern scholars. But he seems to have suggested that we should stop asserting or denying when we reach the unclear cases, rather than trying to draw a precise line where none exists. These investigations into language and logic might seem far removed from practical ethics, but Chrysippus saw them as essential foundations. If we cannot think clearly or use language precisely, we will make errors in every area of philosophy, including ethics. Clear thinking requires understanding how reasoning works, and that requires understanding logic and language. This is why Chrysippus devoted so much of his enormous output to these technical subjects, even though they were less immediately accessible than ethical teachings. Only fragments of Chrysippus's 700 works survive today. We have quotations in other authors, summaries by later philosophers, and occasional passages preserved through unusual circumstances. But the vast majority of what he wrote is lost forever. Fire, decay, the collapse of ancient libraries, the neglect of centuries when people had other concerns than preserving ancient philosophical texts. All of these took their toll. What remains is enough to reconstruct the outlines of his system and to appreciate his genius, but not enough to see the full depth and subtlety of his arguments. This loss is one of the great tragedies of intellectual history. Imagine what we could learn if we had all of Chrysippus's works intact. His detailed responses to objections, his careful analyses of difficult problems, his systematic working through of every implication of Stoic principles. The fragments that survive show a mind of extraordinary power and originality, but they are just fragments. It is like seeing a magnificent building that is mostly collapsed, with only a few walls and pillars still standing to suggest what the whole structure once was. Yet, Chrysippus's influence survived even though his texts did not. Later, Stoics like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius built on the foundations he established. They modified and adapted his teachings for Roman contexts and Roman audiences, but the basic structure of their philosophy remained what Chrysippus had created. When Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations about the importance of accepting fate, distinguishing what is up to us from what is not, and maintaining inner freedom regardless of external circumstances, he was drawing on ideas that Chrysippus had systematized centuries earlier. Medieval and Renaissance philosophers encountered Stoicism primarily through Roman sources like Cicero and Seneca, not through Chrysippus directly. But even these indirect channels transmitted ideas that originated with him. The emphasis on self-discipline, on distinguishing what we can control from what we cannot, on accepting adversity with equanimity, all of these recognizably Stoic themes bear Chrysippus's stamp, even when his name is not mentioned. In modern times, Stoicism has experienced a remarkable revival. People living in comfortable modern societies with unprecedented material prosperity find themselves drawn to an ancient philosophy that teaches indifference to external goods and emphasis on internal character. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective modern psychotherapies, uses techniques that Chrysippus would recognize immediately. The practice of examining and challenging negative thoughts, of distinguishing between circumstances and our interpretations of circumstances, of recognizing that disturbed emotions flow from false beliefs. All of this reflects Stoic psychological insights that Chrysippus helped develop. Modern people reading Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus often have no idea that behind these accessible texts lies the technical philosophy of Chrysippus. They may never learn his name or understand his detailed logical and physical theories, but they benefit from his work nonetheless. The practical wisdom that helps them navigate difficult times and maintain perspective during challenges comes ultimately from the system that Chrysippus built. This is perhaps the greatest form of influence to shape how people think and live centuries after your death, even when they have forgotten who you were. What would Chrysippus think of his legacy? He would probably be indifferent to whether people remembered his name. That would be merely a matter of reputation, an external indifference that has no bearing on the quality of his life or the worth of his work. What would matter to him is whether the ideas he defended were true and whether they helped people live better lives. On that measure, his legacy is secure. The core Stoic insights about virtue, acceptance, and inner freedom remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens. The obsessive productivity that seemed eccentric to his contemporaries served a profound purpose. By working through every objection, by defending every doctrine with exhaustive logical rigor, by creating a complete system that addressed all major philosophical questions, Chrysippus ensured that Stoicism could survive even after he was gone. He built an intellectual fortress so strong that even hostile critics could not tear it down. They could attack individual positions or argue for alternative views, but they could not simply dismiss Stoicism as incoherent or obviously false. Chrysippus had proven that it was neither. Who was Chrysippus as a person, beyond his philosophical achievements? The ancient sources give us only glimpses, but these glimpses reveal someone unusual, even by the standards of eccentric philosophers. He apparently had a sharp wit, and could be quite harsh in his criticism of rival philosophers. When he disagreed with someone's argument, he did not merely point out errors gently. He demolished the argument systematically and thoroughly, sometimes in ways that felt almost cruel. There are stories suggesting that Chrysippus could be stubborn to the point of absurdity. Once, when a student pointed out what seemed to be an inconsistency in one of his arguments, Chrysippus apparently spent days developing an elaborate defense of his original position, rather than simply acknowledging the problem and moving on. This inflexibility could be frustrating for those around him, but it also reflected his deep commitment to logical rigor. He would not abandon a position unless he was absolutely convinced it was wrong, and he would explore every possible defense before conceding a point. Yet there was also something admirable about this stubbornness. How many people will defend their ideas so vigorously? How many will pursue truth with such single-minded intensity that they will sacrifice social comfort and personal relationships to maintain intellectual integrity? Chrysippus was not trying to be popular or to win friends. He was trying to get things right and to defend what he believed was true. This required a kind of courage that is different from physical bravery but no less genuine. The story of his death, as reported by ancient sources, captures something essential about his character. He supposedly died from a fit of laughter after watching a donkey eat figs and offering the donkey wine to wash them down. The image of this serious, intense philosopher, laughing so hard that it killed him, is startling. It suggests that beneath the rigorous logical exterior was someone capable of finding absurdity amusing, someone who had not lost all sense of humor despite his philosophical obsessions. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later invention, it reveals how Chrysippus was remembered. As brilliant, but strange, as dedicated but inflexible, as someone who took philosophy so seriously that it consumed his entire life, but who also retained some connection to ordinary human pleasures and responses. The story suggests that his death was somehow fitting for his life, that even in dying he was doing something characteristic, engaging with the world in his own peculiar way. We might ask whether Chrysippus achieved the wisdom he sought to define and defend. Was he himself a sage, living in perfect alignment with nature and virtue? The answer is almost certainly no. He never claimed to be a sage, and the ancient sources do not suggest that anyone considered him one. He had passions and weaknesses like everyone else. His obsessive productivity might itself be seen as a kind of disturbed emotion, an excessive attachment to writing and philosophical work that a truly wise person would not have. But perhaps this is the wrong question. Chrysippus's importance lies not in whether he personally achieved perfect wisdom, but in what he contributed to human understanding of what wisdom is and how it might be achieved. He was, by his own account, someone making progress toward wisdom, not someone who had reached it. His life was spent trying to understand truth and to help others understand it too. By that measure, by the measure of dedication to truth and serious engagement with fundamental questions, he succeeded brilliantly. Despite all that Chrysippus achieved, significant problems remained in his system. Some of these were apparent to ancient critics and continue to trouble modern interpreters. Others have emerged as our understanding of logic, language, and nature has evolved beyond what the Stoics could have imagined. Examining these problems is not disrespectful to Chrysippus, but rather a way of taking his philosophy seriously enough to ask whether it is actually correct. One major difficulty concerns the Stoic claim that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. Even granting the Stoic distinction between indifference and true goods, is it really plausible that someone being tortured could be happy in any meaningful sense? The Stoics might respond that we are confusing happiness with pleasure or comfort, but this response seems to change the subject. When ordinary people talk about happiness, they mean something that includes feeling good, not just having the right internal attitudes. A philosophy that says you can be happy while experiencing extreme suffering seems to be using the word happiness in a way that disconnects it from ordinary meaning. Another problem concerns the relationship between determinism and responsibility. Chrysippus tried hard to reconcile these, but many critics remain unconvinced. If everything I do is determined by prior causes, stretching back before I was born, in what sense am I actually responsible for my actions? The Stoic answer is that responsibility does not require being an uncaused cause, but only that actions flow from your character. But if your character itself was shaped by factors beyond your control, this seems to push responsibility back without actually solving the problem. At some point, the chain of causes reaches back to things that clearly were not up to you. And if those earlier causes determined your character, which determined your actions, how can you be truly responsible? The doctrine of eternal recurrence also raises troubling questions. If the cosmos cycles through exactly the same pattern of events infinitely many times, what is the point of striving for virtue? If everything that will happen has already happened infinite times before and will happen infinite times again, nothing you do ultimately matters. Chrysippus would say that this is precisely why you should focus on virtue rather than trying to change cosmic outcomes. But this feels more like resignation than a satisfying answer. The Stoic analysis of emotions as false judgments has also been challenged. Are all emotions really cognitive in the way the Stoics claimed? Some modern research suggests that emotions have physiological and neural components that are not straightforwardly reducible to beliefs or judgments. If emotions are partly non-cognitive bodily responses, then the Stoic therapeutic program of eliminating emotions through correcting false beliefs may be impossible or at least incomplete. You might correct someone's beliefs while their emotional responses continue, because those responses are generated by brain systems that are not entirely controlled by conscious rational judgment. The Stoic cosmology in physics, brilliant as it was by ancient standards, is simply incompatible with modern scientific understanding. The idea that the cosmos cycles through conflagrations and renewals, that pneuma is a kind of divine breath permeating matter, that reason is a material substance, all of this conflicts with what we now know about physics, astronomy, and biology. This does not mean Stoic ethics must be abandoned, but it does mean we cannot simply accept Chrysippus' system as a whole. We would need to rebuild Stoic ethics on different metaphysical foundations if we want to make it compatible with modern science. There are also internal tensions within the Stoic system that Chrysippus never fully resolved. If virtue is knowledge and vice is ignorance, why is moral progress so difficult? If we simply need to understand what is truly good and what is indifferent, why does understanding this not immediately produce virtuous action? Chrysippus recognized that habituation and practice are necessary, but this seems to concede that something more than knowledge is involved in virtue. There is a gap between intellectual understanding and character transformation that the Stoic equation of virtue with wisdom does not adequately explain. The Stoic treatment of external goods as indifferent also creates practical difficulties. If health, wealth, and life itself are merely indifferent, why should we care about social justice, poverty, or oppression? The Stoics said these are preferred indifference that we should try to promote, but this seems inconsistent. If they are truly indifferent to happiness and well-being, why prefer them at all? And if we do have good reason to prefer them, does this not suggest they are goods, after all, just not the only goods? These questions are not offered as definitive refutations of Chrysippus or Stoicism. They are invitations to engage with the philosophy seriously, testing its claims against experience and reason. Chrysippus himself would have wanted this kind of critical examination. He spent his life defending Stoicism against objections precisely because he believed that truth could withstand scrutiny. A philosophy that requires blind acceptance without questioning is not worthy of rational beings. The fact that we can identify problems and tensions in Chrysippus' system does not diminish his achievement, but shows that philosophy is an ongoing conversation across centuries, where each generation must reconsider what earlier thinkers established. In an age of neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and artificial intelligence, Why should anyone care about the philosophical system of an ancient Greek who died more than 2,000 years ago? Why does Chrysippus still matter? The answer is that despite all the advances in our empirical understanding of the world and human nature, the fundamental questions Chrysippus grappled with remain unresolved. How should we live? What really matters? How can we be happy in a world we do not control? What is the relationship between our inner freedom and external circumstances? These questions are as urgent now as they were in ancient Athens. Modern life brings pressures and challenges that Chrysippus never imagined. Information overload, social media anxiety, climate change, political polarization, the erosion of traditional sources of meaning and community. Yet the basic structure of the human predicament remains recognizable. We still want things we cannot have. We still suffer losses and disappointments. We still struggle to make sense of our lives and to find peace in uncertain circumstances. We still face the question of how to respond to adversity with wisdom rather than being destroyed by it. The Stoic approach that Chrysippus systematized offers practical tools for addressing these perennial human challenges. The practice of distinguishing what is up to us from what is not up to us helps combat the anxiety that comes from trying to control things beyond our power. The recognition that our disturbed emotions flow from our judgments rather than from external circumstances themselves empowers us to change our emotional responses by changing our beliefs. The emphasis on virtue as the only true good provides a stable foundation for self-worth that does not depend on external validation or success. These practices are not just theoretical abstractions, but have been tested by millions of people across centuries who found that they actually work. Marcus Aurelius used Stoic principles to maintain his sanity and moral compass while dealing with military campaigns, political crises, and plague. Epictetus used them to preserve his dignity and freedom while living as a slave. Countless ordinary people, whose names we do not know, use them to endure hardships, maintain relationships, and find meaning in difficult circumstances. This track record suggests that Stoicism taps into something real about human psychology and the human condition. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy has independently rediscovered many Stoic insights and incorporated them into effective treatments for anxiety, depression, and other psychological problems. The core CBT technique of identifying and challenging negative automatic thoughts is essentially the Stoic practice of examining impressions before giving assent to them. The recognition that how we interpret events matters more than the events themselves reflects the Stoic distinction between external circumstances and our judgments about them. These parallels suggest that the Stoics were onto something genuine about how human minds work and how they can be improved. But Chrysippus offers more than just therapeutic techniques for managing stress and negative emotions. He offers a comprehensive worldview that locates human life within a rational cosmos governed by divine providence. Whether or not we accept the metaphysical details of Stoic cosmology, the vision itself addresses a deep human need for meaning and significance. We want to feel that our lives matter, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that there is some order and purpose to existence. Chrysippus's vision of rational beings participating consciously in the logos of the cosmos provides one powerful answer to these needs. The Stoic emphasis on cosmopolitanism, on recognizing all human beings as fellow rational creatures deserving of respect and moral concern, remains profoundly relevant in our globalized world. We need philosophical frameworks that can help us think beyond narrow tribal identities and local loyalties to recognize our common humanity. Chrysippus's idea that all rational beings are citizens of a cosmic city provides exactly this kind of framework. It suggests that our deepest loyalty should be to reason and virtue rather than to nation, ethnicity, or any other conventional distinction. Perhaps most importantly, Chrysippus exemplifies a way of doing philosophy that we need today. He took ideas seriously and was willing to follow arguments wherever they led. He did not look for easy answers or comforting platitudes, but grappled honestly with difficult questions. He built comprehensive systems that tried to address all the major problems, rather than focusing narrowly on one area. He was willing to revise and develop his ideas in response to objections rather than dogmatically defending whatever he first thought. This approach to philosophy, rigorous and systematic yet open to revision, is something we can learn from regardless of whether we agree with his specific conclusions. Stoicism after Chrysippus continued to develop and change. Roman Stoics like Panaetius and Posidonius modified some of his doctrines, making Stoicism more palatable to Roman aristocrats and broadening its appeal. They softened some of the harsher paradoxes and paid more attention to emotions as having some positive value rather than being entirely negative. Later figures like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius focused more on practical ethics and personal development, and less on the technical logic and physics that Chrysippus had emphasized. This evolution shows that Stoicism was always a living tradition rather than a fixed dogma. Each generation of Stoics had to reinterpret the philosophy for their own circumstances and questions. The core commitments remained: the focus on virtue, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not, the ideal of living in accordance with nature. But how these commitments were understood and applied changed over time. This is as it should be. A philosophy that never changes in response to new challenges and new understanding is a dead philosophy, a museum piece, rather than a living guide for life. The question for us is whether Stoicism can continue to evolve in ways that make it relevant for the 21st century and beyond. Can we preserve what is valuable in Chrysippus's system while updating or abandoning elements that no longer fit with our best understanding of reality? Can we maintain the Stoic emphasis on virtue and inner freedom, while acknowledging that external circumstances do affect human flourishing in ways the Stoics underestimated? Can we keep the Stoic therapeutic practices while integrating them with modern psychology and neuroscience? Some contemporary philosophers and psychologists think this is possible, and have been working to create what might be called modern Stoicism or Neo-Stoicism. They draw on Stoic insights about emotions, values, and resilience, while remaining agnostic about metaphysical questions that cannot be settled and that may not matter for practical purposes. They use Stoic exercises like negative visualization, dichotomy of control, and view from above as tools for psychological development, without necessarily accepting the full Stoic cosmology or physics. This pragmatic approach has much to recommend it. It takes what works from ancient Stoicism and applies it to modern life without requiring belief in doctrines that may seem implausible or unnecessary. But it also loses something important. The therapeutic techniques made sense within the context of a comprehensive worldview that explained why they worked and why they mattered. Removing them from that context and treating them as mere tools or life hacks may undermine their effectiveness. If you practice Stoic exercises purely for instrumental reasons, to feel better or be more productive, you may miss the deeper transformation that comes from genuinely adopting a Stoic perspective on reality. The challenge is to find a middle way that preserves the depth and comprehensiveness of Chrysippus's philosophical vision, while making it compatible with modern knowledge and sensibilities. This is not easy and may not even be fully possible. But the attempt itself is worthwhile because it forces us to think seriously about fundamental questions that modern culture often ignores or dismisses. What is the good life for human beings? How should we respond to suffering and loss? What is the relationship between individual flourishing and cosmic order? What role does philosophy itself play in human development and well-being? Chrysippus believed that philosophy was not just an academic discipline, but a way of life, a therapeutic practice that could heal the soul and lead to genuine happiness. This vision of philosophy has been largely lost in the modern world, where philosophy is primarily a professional academic field focused on technical problems. Reviving Chryssippian Stoicism means reviving this older conception of philosophy as something that matters for how you actually live, rather than just what you know intellectually. At night, if you walk through the streets of Athens where Chrysippus once taught, you will find no monuments to him. There are ruins of ancient buildings, traces of the civilization he inhabited, but nothing that marks where he lived or worked. His tomb, if it was ever marked at all, has long since crumbled to dust. The Stoic school, where he spent decades teaching and writing, no longer exists. Even the texts he produced with such obsessive dedication are gone. In physical terms, almost nothing remains. Yet something persists. The ideas he refined and systematized continue to shape how people think about ethics, logic, and the human condition. The practices he helped develop still help people navigate difficult circumstances with greater wisdom and resilience. The vision he articulated of rational beings participating in a rational cosmos continues to inspire and guide those who seek meaning in what often appears to be a chaotic and indifferent universe. This is the strange nature of philosophical influence. The person vanishes completely, but the thoughts remain, transmitted through chains of teachers and students, texts and readers, extending across centuries and cultures. Think about what Chrysippus achieved. He took a philosophy that was vulnerable to criticism and collapse, and transformed it into an intellectual fortress that would endure for centuries. He did this not through charisma or political power, but through sheer force of logical argument and systematic thinking. He demonstrated that ideas carefully reasoned and rigorously defended could be more powerful than wealth, armies, or empires. The Roman Empire that eventually adopted and spread Stoicism has fallen. The physical structures that seemed permanent have crumbled. But the ideas persist because they address truths about human nature and the human situation that remain constant across changing historical circumstances. This is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it shows how little of what seems solid and permanent actually lasts. The buildings decay, the books burn, the names are forgotten. But inspiring because it shows that some things, the right things, do endure. Truth is more permanent than stone. Wisdom outlasts bronze. A good argument will still be convincing 1,000 years after the person who first made it has vanished completely from memory. Chrysippus would have appreciated this. He believed in the eternal logos, the rational principle that structures reality and makes it intelligible. This logos does not depend on any particular person or culture. It is not changed by political events or historical accidents. Individual rational beings come and go, but reason itself persists. The Stoic philosopher's task is to align themselves with this eternal reason, to participate consciously in it during their brief time of existence. Whether anyone remembers their name afterwards is irrelevant. What matters is whether they contributed to the ongoing project of understanding and living according to truth. In this sense, Chrysippus succeeded completely. He made his contribution to understanding truth. He built structures of thought that others could use and develop. He defended insights that would help countless people across centuries to live better lives. The fact that most people who benefit from his work do not know his name does not diminish this achievement. It confirms it. The ideas have become so integrated into how we think that we no longer need to cite their source. They have passed into common wisdom, available to anyone who seeks them. There is a deeper lesson here about the nature of legacy and the meaning of a life well lived. We often think that what matters is being remembered, having our names inscribed in history, leaving some permanent mark on the world. But Chrysippus suggests a different understanding. What matters is whether you lived according to truth and whether your life contributed something valuable to the ongoing human project of understanding and flourishing. If you do these things, your life has ultimate meaning and value, regardless of whether anyone remembers who you were. This is liberation from one of the deepest sources of human anxiety, the fear of being forgotten, of our lives ultimately meaning nothing. Chrysippus shows that this fear is based on false understanding of what gives life meaning. Your worth does not depend on future reputation. It depends on present virtue. If you live wisely and contribute what you can to the advancement of understanding and human well-being, your life has fulfilled its purpose. Whether the cosmos remembers you or not is irrelevant. The cosmos itself will eventually end in conflagration and begin again. But the pattern of your life, the choices you made, the character you developed, these are eternal parts of how things are. They cannot be erased because they are woven into the fabric of reality itself. When we step back and consider Chrysippus's achievement in its totality, we see something remarkable. Here was a person who dedicated his entire life to a single project, understanding reality correctly and showing others how to live well based on that understanding. He did not seek fame or power or wealth. He sought truth and pursued it with relentless intensity that struck even his contemporaries as excessive. He wrote 700 books, not because he wanted to be remembered as prolific, but because he could not rest while questions remained unanswered or objections remained unaddressed. This obsessive dedication produced the most complete and systematic articulation of Stoic philosophy that the ancient world would ever see. Before Chrysippus, Stoicism was one promising philosophical school among many. After Chrysippus, it was the dominant philosophy of the educated classes throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries. This transformation happened because Chrysippus provided what the school desperately needed: logical rigor, systematic completeness, and effective responses to every major criticism. The rules that he built, the systematic structure of Stoic logic, physics, and ethics, became the framework within which generations of later thinkers worked. Even those who disagreed with specific Stoic doctrines had to engage with the system that Chrysippus created. You could not simply ignore Stoicism or dismiss it as obviously false. You had to argue against it point by point, and Chrysippus had made sure that every point was well defended. This intellectual achievement is rare in philosophy. Most thinkers contribute one or two important ideas. Chrysippus constructed an entire worldview and made it rationally defensible against all comers. But we should not lose sight of the human being behind this achievement. Chrysippus was not simply a reasoning machine producing arguments. He was a person with passions, quirks, and probably struggles that we can only guess at. The obsessive productivity might have been driven partly by anxiety or inner demons that he was trying to quiet through constant work. The social isolation and eccentricity might have been symptoms of difficulty connecting with others in ordinary human ways. We do not know and probably will never know. What we can say is that he found in philosophy something that gave his life meaning and purpose. He found questions worth pursuing with everything he had. He found ideas worth defending with rigorous argument and systematic development. He found a vision of how human beings could live that seemed to him true and important enough to dedicate his entire existence to articulating and defending it. Whether he was always happy in the ordinary sense, whether he achieved the sage-like wisdom he described, we cannot know. But he lived a life of complete dedication to what he believed mattered most. That is its own form of success. Now, more than 2 millennia after his death, we can look back and see that his contribution was real and lasting. The Stoic insights that help people today cope with anxiety, find meaning in difficult circumstances, and maintain their integrity in challenging times. These insights exist because Chrysippus systematized and defended them. The logical methods that philosophers still use to analyze arguments and identify fallacies trace back in part to his innovations. The recognition that how we interpret events matters more than the events themselves, a core principle of modern cognitive therapy, was central to his philosophy. He built rules that worked. Not in the sense of rigid prescriptions that must be followed without question, but in the sense of reliable principles that help human beings navigate the perennial challenges of existence. Rules about distinguishing what is up to us from what is not. Rules about examining our judgments before accepting them as true. Rules about focusing on virtue rather than external goods. Rules about accepting what happens as part of a rational cosmic order. These rules have been tested by millions of people across vastly different cultures and historical periods, and they have proven their worth. The man who built these rules has vanished almost completely from history. But the rules remain, available to anyone who needs them. This is perhaps exactly as it should be, according to Stoic principles. The person is temporary and unimportant. What matters is whether they contributed to the logos, the rational principle that orders reality and guides those who align themselves with it. Chrysippus made his contribution, built his rules, and passed into silence. The rules echo still, helping people to live more wisely and well. That is a legacy worth having, whether anyone remembers your name or not. In the end, Chrysippus teaches us something profound about what it means to live a meaningful life. It is not about being famous or remembered. It is not about achieving conventional success or accumulating external goods. It is about dedicating yourself to what truly matters, pursuing truth with complete honesty and courage, and contributing what you can to the ongoing human project of understanding and flourishing. If you do these things, your life has ultimate meaning regardless of how it appears to others or how history remembers you. That is the final lesson from the man who wrote 700 books that almost no one today has read. The books are gone, but the wisdom they contain persists. The person has vanished, but the contribution remains. This is how ideas transcend their creators, how truth outlasts those who discover it, how a life dedicated to wisdom can echo across centuries, even after every physical trace has disappeared. Chrysippus built his rules, lived according to them as well as he could, and trusted that truth would persist without him. He was right. The rules remain, still helping, still guiding, still offering wisdom to any who seek it. That is more than most people achieve in a lifetime. It is enough.